Hey, well, hi there. I'm Taylor Larson, and I'm the coordinator for the new Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program. I've been in the position since June. I am an admitted recovering farmer and burgeoning civil servant. So I kind of come to this work from an agricultural background, have quite a bit of experience working with our local soil and water conservation district, as well as the watershed council, FSA, NRCS, and other conservation partners. Just spending a lot of PSL.
I will sing Taylor's praises, something you probably don't know. Taylor was the treasurer of our PAC when we did our campaign
Before
for
I joined OLIP.
And the fact that we were successful in getting our tax base, a lot of the credit goes to Taylor in handling our finances. So that's another unsung thing.
Appreciate that. All that to say is I kind of stepped backwards into this work from the perspective looking at how do we put all these pieces together that are out there. We all want to support farmers and farmland being successful both economically and ecologically. And there's lots of resources out there to help folks do it. The real challenge is finding the right place, the right space, and kind of the right time to be doing that work. So the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program is designed to do that. So you can go to the next slide. So before I dive into kind of the mechanics of the program itself, I just kind of wanted to set the stage, sort of the context that we're working in. And I'm sure most of you are pretty familiar with this, right? You know, agriculture in Oregon is a big part of our GDP, our economic base. You know, it's 13%. It's our second largest land use, right? And so, you know, any positive impacts we can have on farmland are going to have big impacts kind of throughout the state on the big picture level. I thought this number right here is pretty interesting. Around, you know, 40,000, there are about 40,000 farms in Oregon. I mean, that number is a bit of a misnomer because, you know, what classifies a farm sometimes is a little bit questionable. But if we take that at face value and we understand that the vast majority of those farms are family owned. And over 2/3 of them are going to be changing hands over the next 2 decades. And so if you do the math on that real quick, that's roughly 1,000 farms per year that are changing hands. And that moment in time is, and I see it as a major opportunity. That's when the folks who are in charge of making management decisions are changing. There's an opportunity to take wisdom and knowledge gained over a lifetime and transfer that to the folks who are going to be managing that land far into the future. And it's so easy as a farmer or a rancher to get locked into a specific production system that may or may not, you know, in this context, have the most soil benefits, soil health benefits. But when you're going through a transition in management, you can be looking at, you know, taking on different cropping systems or production schemes. It's just a real opportunity. If we can be at the table and help folks access resources who are interested in making some sort of transition and empower them with the tools to make that a healthy soils transition, I think we can find a lot of success to go on. So the purpose of the program is kind of threefold here. There's 3 main purposes, but I did want to highlight that just about everything that we're trying to do in the Ag Heritage Program touches on soil health, right? And so the first purpose of the program, and I do want to apologize for the text heavy slides. I have some really beautiful pictures and the internet ate them. So I'm not quite sure what's going on, but anyway, the content's good, I promise. So to increase the economic viability of Oregon's agricultural and economic sector, right? And so if you think what makes an economically viable agricultural operation, it starts with the soil. If you don't have healthy soils, you're going to have higher input costs. You're going to have higher, you know, well, fertilizers and pesticides and lower yields. And so it's going to be harder to make a living as an agricultural producer if your soils aren't in good, healthy condition. The second purpose is to reduce the conversion and fragmentation of Oregon's working land. And so really there, we're looking at, our best agricultural land are on our prime soils throughout the state. And so it's important that we think, especially as farms are going through a transition, how do we keep those prime soils that have the potential to be healthy and productive in agricultural production and not in a housing development or a golf course and so on and so forth, so that that resource base is available to the next generation. And then third, finally, is to enhance fish or wildlife habitat, water quality, and other natural resources on Oregon's working land. And so, like I was mentioning in the beginning, these transitions in land management are an opportunity to be looking at those natural resources and what it is that sustains a farm both economically and ecologically, and look for ways to enhance those so that that next generation has the tools in place, the supporting ecosystem, agricultural ecosystem, to help them thrive. So kind of the approach we take, the Ag Heritage Program is like I mentioned, there's sort of back of the napkin, there's roughly 1,000 farms transitioning every year. So how do we figure out, as conservation professionals, how do we get at as many of those tables as possible to help folks make that transition successful, both for the viability of the agricultural operation and then the health of the associated agricultural ecosystem, and really engage with the change that's happening. Look at that as an opportunity. I think we can all agree that things don't stay the same. I mean, that's like the one constant, right? So the economy is going to look different in 20 years from now than it looks today. It definitely looks different today than it did 20 years ago. And as we start to think about what is the ecological situation going to look like in 20 to 50 years from now, and what does the farm need to look like if it's going to thrive in a potentially changing environment? And so just being at the table and helping folks kind of literally pull their head out of the soil, because as a farmer, it can be difficult to do some of this long range planning, right? It's a relatively low margin business. And if you spend too much time thinking sort of 20 years out, you're going to miss, the step that you need to take 6 months from now. And you very well may not have a sustainable farming business to be managing 20 years down the line. So just, I guess all that to say that I've found it very valuable to have folks who can engage with you on sort of those longer time horizons, so that you can get into that headspace and have some accountability partnership and not have to just do all that thinking on your own, because sometimes it feels like it doesn't rise to the very top of the priority list. And so that's what I mean when I say focus on big picture basics, right? So the tools are designed to help folks figure out, how are we going to grow food in the long run? How are we going to protect our water quality? And then what are we going to do about making sure that these agricultural ecosystems are good habitat, not just for fish and wildlife, that's really important, but also for human beings who are operating those farms and ranches, as well as soil organisms who are living in the soil. So that habitat idea is, how do we make this a thriving place to live? And then we come with tools, right? These complementary tools. So we're helping to stabilize the resource base for future generations, making sure folks have the nuts and bolts of what they need in order to be running successful agriculturally based businesses. And then we facilitate that transition, or empower others to facilitate that transition. So we can go to the next slide. And so the Agricultural Heritage Program at OWEB is a grant program, right? Because it's at OWEB, that's what we do. We make grants. And so we have kind of 4 main buckets of grants. And again, all of these, like I mentioned at the top, sort of do touch soil health, just sort of in different ways. And I'm going to really hone in on the bottom one here, but I just want to touch on all 4. So we do what are called working land conservation easements. And most folks are probably familiar with what those are, but the idea is to keep farmland, and farmland will buy up development rights. And then that land, we will either do it in a covenant, like a term covenant, or a permanent easement. So just securing the, those productive farmlands throughout the state so that the next generation has an opportunity to be farming on those lands. And then we also will be making grants to support succession planning. And so again, this is investing in folks like yours time and energy that it takes to be at those kitchen tables and helping folks think through what are the mechanics of efficiently and effectively passing on this agricultural operation from one generation to the next. And that can be a really heavy lift, and there's lots of opportunities to fall through the cracks. So it's important that we have folks who understand sort of the opportunities and the pitfalls, holding folks' hands as they go through that transition. Then we'll also be making technical assistance grants. And again, this is investing in the human capital needed to not just do the succession planning, but more sort of focused on developing conservation easements and leading the conservation management plans. Because again, it takes time to develop projects. And if we don't have the folks on the ground doing this work, it's hard to get these projects, over the finish line. And then finally, we have a tool. It's called conservation management planning. And this is kind of a catch-all, but the idea is that it's designed to facilitate a long-term relationship between conservation planner and the farmer or rancher. And that long-term relationship very well may span generations. So we make plans we make grants both to develop the plans, and then also we'll be making grants in the future to implement those plans and pay for a series of soil health and other, associated conservation practices. So next slide. So again, apologize for the text here. Imagine a couple of nice pictures there and not cut off on the edge either.
I don't know. Yeah, it's been doing that with all the presentations, but it's unclear why.
Okay. Anyway, no big deal. So I just threw up the purpose of the conservation management plan here because I feel like this is really our soil health tool, right? And so, like I mentioned, there are there's any number of practices that we understand to promote soil health, but getting folks to implement those can be challenging, especially over the long run, because you have to take into account the opportunity costs of changing a practice, the economic impacts on the operation itself, and just does this, as Bruce was mentioning to me earlier, does this make my job as a farmer easier? And in a lot of cases, change is hard. And so what these grants are designed to do is to pay both for the time of the conservation planner as well as support the agricultural operator in developing a long-term vision, 20 to 50 years, for what their farm needs to look like, 20 to 50 years from now, if it's going to be successful. So what's the agricultural infrastructure, the ecological infrastructure that needs to be in place for this farm to be successful? So that could include things like, what do the riparian buffers need to look like? What does the fencing and water infrastructure need to look like? What is this, what sort of shape does the soil need to be in if this farm is going to be thriving, a generation or two generations from now? And so, we support folks to sort of engage in that planning process. And then once you have that plan in place, there's mechanisms to then pay for the implementation of the plan. And those are currently being developed. So maybe go to the next slide. So yeah, just things to note. So like Megan and I were talking about just a little bit earlier, this conservation management plan funding is designed to be sort of the state's contribution to fill gaps in the conservation landscape, right? So one gap we're looking at is, can we use these conservation management plans to sort of synthesize all of the existing conservation programs out there and have, as a producer, potentially one plan that sort of lays out your whole conservation strategy as opposed to needing. I mean, you'll still need a grazing management plan and a forest management plan and maybe your associated CREP plan. But can this be a framework to sort of hang all of those off of and then come in with, state ag heritage funding to fill gaps so that you can be implementing the plan sort of holistically. And these plans are going to look different depending on what your resource concerns are, where you are in the state, and potentially what the funding source is. So currently, the Ag Heritage Program is funded with general funds from the state legislature. But we have a fund that's set up that can receive funds from other sources that may have certain stipulations attached to them. And so long as they meet the purpose of the program, we could be pushing those through the Ag Heritage program. So if you think the conservation management plan language is a little vague, I would agree with you. And I think that's part of the reason is we want it to be a flexible tool that's going to meet folks where they're at, both people who are looking to fund this work and folks who are looking to implement it on the ground. And then, you can go for it. And like I mentioned, we have this, we've just closed a grant cycle, both for conservation easements and for the development of conservation management plans. But we are currently working on developing a methodology to actually pay for the implementation of those conservation management plans. With the recognition that folks who put in grants this year are in a little bit of a tough situation where we're asking folks to put together a conservation management plan without a clear methodology for how we're going to pay for the implementation of that plan. But that's how these types of programs work, and it's always a chicken and the egg situation. But we have done a feasibility analysis on what sorts of practices we could pay for with this tool. And a big focus of that feasibility analysis as things that would be relatively straightforward to pay for is kind of centered around soil health. I'm sure many of you have seen this diagram or something similar before, kind of the 4 principles of soil health. And so we're currently working on a methodology with a consultant and sort of a team of advisors. Ken is going to actually help us back there. And so thank you, Ken. To put together a methodology so that by next year, when we have another cycle for these conservation management plans open, we'll have a clear implementation methodology so that folks know as they're developing plans, how those plans actually, how we fund the implementation of those. And so if anybody's interested in engaging in that conversation, I would encourage you to reach out to me. We can figure out the best way to plug you in, because it's really important that this implementation methodology, I think it could be really powerful, works for folks on the ground. So I think next slide real quick. I was just going to pull this up really fast. This is from that feasibility analysis I was talking about, of the sorts of practices that this program could pay for and how feasible they might be to actually measure the impact. And so you'll see the darker the green, the more feasible it is for us to sort of measure the impact. And there's a carbon header there that has the most dark green. And you'll see kind of like Bruce was talking about, some of the associated co-benefits. So for instance, if you are doing a range or forage planting, you very well could document some carbon benefits, but you're also going to have some associated habitat benefits and water quality benefits. And so it's the part of the methodology development we're working on is how do you determine a value for a certain practice that takes in all of the associated co-benefits without double counting. And so it's kind of wonky, and we're working with some economists on that and trying to figure out how in the weeds is appropriate to get. All that to say that it's not fully fleshed out yet, but it does look like we'll likely have a pretty big focus on soil health and the associated carbon benefits, just because those are some of the easier things to measure and quantify, and are going to have sort of those associated agricultural viability benefits to the operation in the long run. And we'll hear more about the interaction between soil health and carbon from our friends to my right as well. So I'm probably running out of time, so I think I'll stop right there. I look forward to questions and a discussion around this, especially over the coming year. This is the community of folks who we'll be leaning on to help sort of implement this program. And we're building it as it's going down the track. So invite you all to hop on board.